For the second part of our unit on divergence, I want to look at something referred to as conceptual blending, the idea of taking two concepts and blending them together. To begin with, I'd like you to take a few minutes to draw and design a hat. Take a piece of paper and a pencil and just come up with a design for a hat. So stop the audio lecture now and then return when you've designed a hat. Okay. Now I want you to draw and design a second hat, but this time I want you to connect the concept of insect with the concept of hat. So take the idea of an insect, whatever that means to you, however you want to imagine it, and combine it somehow imaginatively with the idea of a hat and draw a second hat. Let's take a few minutes to do that. Okay, now I want to ask you, which design do you think is more creative and imaginative? Now, people often say the first, but most people actually say the second, which is not that surprising, because what we've done in this exercise is we've taken your typical idea of what you might kind of conjure up as a hat, a baseball cap, a top hat, whatever. You're basing it on your history and your experience, and your first hat was probably much more stereotypical. But when I asked you to combine a second element, something totally bizarre and unusual, you probably stretched the idea of hat a little bit more. You probably made something a little more creative, a little more interesting, a little more innovative. And so this is the basis of conceptual blending. It's the idea that when we combine two things that are very different from each other, we present the possibility of coming up with something new and something unique. Combining random words is a really good exercise in training your mind to be able to do that. So to do this, you just need to generate random words. You can open a book, stick your finger in it, cut up words from a magazine, throw them all up in the air and pick up two. It doesn't matter. So whether you're combining two words that are very different and random, or whether you're combining a random word with an idea or an object, it doesn't matter how you get the words. Just try to, when you get your words, stick to it. Don't think, oh, I don't like that word, I'm going to pick another. Because the idea here is that by having unusual words that seem to have no relationship between each other, crumb and flour, for example, we can come up with combinations that are really kind of interesting and unique. So by thinking of the word crumb, you might come up with things like messy, or small pieces, or separate little pieces, flour and water. Inside a cake, a piece of food, you might think of bread or toast or anything like that. Or you might push the idea of crumb and think of Robert Crumb, the famous cartoonist, or the slang expression of crumb being a worthless person. And do the same with flour. Just mind map or associate and come up with a list of words. And then what you can do is you connect any word on the left-hand column with any word on the right-hand column and use this method as a way of unpacking the terms to create another set of meanings. So for example, if we were to combine crumb as being something inside a cake with petals, flower petals, we might come up with the obvious and simple yet rather unusual and creative idea of a piece of cake that when you cut into it, the middle section, flowers and petals all come cascading out. Whether they're edible ones or not, it doesn't matter necessarily. So this is a concept of combining two things to get something which, I looked online for cakes that had flowers in them, and there aren't any out there. At least as far as I can tell in my short research, this is what I did find. It's actually a flower arrangement with a plastic fake wedding cake enclosure holding it. But what I was describing was something the opposite, where you have a real cake, and in the middle of each of those tiers, flowers could pop out. This could be a great idea for a cake company, a startup, a creative business. If you choose to do this yourself, just remember you heard it here first, and I get 15%. So this idea of combining things has been around forever. However, it was first given a kind of analytical formulation where it was discussed and studied and explicated by Arthur Koestler in the early part of the 20th century. And he looked at this whole concept of combining, and he gave it the term bisociation, which he understood as the blending of elements from unrelated frames of thought that he called matrices. And so by connecting these two things, you find a line of connection For instance, in this was the diagram that he used, one plane of reference, M1, and another plane, matrix 2, and where they combine is this line, and then somewhere along the line you're going to get these flashes of ideas and differences. And so this concept, like I said, is actually a very old concept. We're going to be analyzing that shortly. But it's something that is relatively straightforward and easy to do. You literally combine things and see what you can get. This whole idea of blending has been more developed and given a much more updated language, vocabulary, nuance, and description by the work of George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, especially in metaphor theory, and Facunier and Turner looking at blending theory. And so by way of cognitive linguistics, we've come up with a whole array of language and ways of understanding this particular process of combining things. And so we find it in our world and kind of everywhere. You know, just the obvious things like eBay or Amazon that we use are actually combinations of two things that are already existing. And that's the thing about conceptual blending, is that it reveals creativity as not some sort of magic, pulling a cat out of a hat, or things out of thin air, but of taking things that already exist and putting them together. So some of the most long-standing, influential inventions are simply just these types of things, like the clock radio. You might be able to remember the day when our side tables had clocks and radios, and then they had clock radios. How about this one? This is probably the most startling in my mind. The luggage, the trunk, the case, and wheels both had been around for millennia until this was invented. And this wasn't invented until 1970 by Bernard Sato. Sato was in the luggage business, but he was the kind of person, and this is one of the traits of creative people we're going to look at, they also are people who are problem finders. So rather than a solution-oriented person who's trying to come up with a great idea to fix something, they actually find the problem first, and then the solution's right at hand. And what I mean by that is many of us accept the routines and the actions and the objects in our lives as finished, or that's how things are. That's the sort of difficulties we have to put up with. But problem finders are people that question those assumptions and say, well, why do I have to carry suitcase? Why do I have to squeeze toothpaste out of a tube? Why do I... And so by raising these questions, they come up with inventions. And so the pull luggage made its debut in the 1970s. What's fascinating about this particular story is that the companies that then picked up on it, Samsonite for example, they were unable to market these to men for about 7 years. So in other words, men, they'd be the lady in the background here, too macho, and women, being a rather intelligent half of the species, here they are pulling it on their wheels. Whereas today, we don't think twice about having wheels in our luggage. But Kessler's biassociation theory also extended this concept beyond creativity and looked at how pervasive it is in our culture and our everyday world. In particular, he noticed that humor and puns and jokes rely a lot on two frames of reference combining with each other, whether that's verbal or visual. For example, here's some verbal puns. And here are some visual puns. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you a few of them. And if you want to try and guess what it is, just after you see the picture, pause, because I'm going to tell you what they are. This is Dr. Pepper. This is light beer. A salted peanut. And Reese with a spoon and Reese without a spoon. This is the other thing about not taking things at face value. Sometimes the creative way is to take them at extremely face value, meaning very, very literally. And so looking at words and combinations of words and phrases and noticing that at a very literal level, what are they actually saying to us? So another example of that might be this, a couple of garbage cans. The one on the left is something we see all over the place, and it usually means please put your waste here. But if we just look at it as a phrase, waste please, okay, it's telling us to just waste things, especially juxtaposed next to something that says recycle please, as if they're both giving us instructions as to what to do. And I did find that last part humorous. And finally, that. Food pairings is another area where conceptual blending happens a lot. A lot of celebrity chefs today make their name on combining unusual flavors, textures, colors, scents, etc. in their cooking. Have a guess at what you think this is. This is Graham Elliott's combination of foie gras and pop rocks. High culture and low culture combined in one superb image. Personally, I'm not a meat eater, so superb might not be the best word, but it is a rather interesting combination. Or this, white chocolate and caviar. So a lot of chefs today are trying to think of unusual combinations, and there's actually a whole science about it, where it goes into certain tastes, that if they have this one particular quality in common, then any two things that have that quality can be compared. But sometimes people just, they're working from pure intuition, as is this person. Some people might find it disgusting, other people might find it absolutely brilliant, and they'd be willing to pay $3.99 for it, no problem. Combining elements is something we find in a lot of innovative products. For example, the cup you can eat, the couch and the cat play tube, college dorm heaven, and so on and so forth. Not always very practical, but kind of ingenious and somewhat humorous at the same time. Modern art combines things all the time. In fact, it's one of the cornerstones of modern art, is taking unusual things, removing them from their normal context, and recontextualizing them in something else. Like Dali's famous phone, lobster phone. Here, again, we saw Dali earlier. Remember the surrealist movement in art, which is trying to give us a sort of conceptual jolt to knock us out of our habitual ways of thinking and to think differently or freshly about things. We also saw Merritt Oppenheim's saucer and cup. But here is a British Nigerian artist, Yinka Shonibare, and he's combining this whole notion of Enlightenment Europe and colonial Europe with the people of Africa and African fabrics and textiles, which they themselves have an interesting story too, because these particular ones are pretty modern, but the traditional textiles that were very prevalent within Africa at this time were actually sold to Africa by British textile merchants who got the ideas from the Dutch, who stole them from the Indonesians. And this is something Shonibare goes through in his work. So his work is just not visual, but he's got this entire history of fabric and patterning and colonialism and imperialism. Very fascinating artist. Or Caravaggio's Chocolate Jesus, My Sweet Lord, which when it was hung in New York a few years ago, had to be removed because of the outcry from the religious right, when in fact Cavallaro was actually trying to make a statement about Easter. This was hung during Easter, about how we tend to trivialize all of our holidays, and the religious dimension or the memorializing dimension of our holidays has been turned into a shopping opportunity as well as a barbecue opportunity. And Banksy, some of you might have seen his work. He's a graffiti artist, and here he is combining the long-standing tradition of generals in war and graffiti and anti-war protesting. So this was a work that Banksy actually snuck into the British Portrait Gallery. Before he was famous for doing his outdoor graffiti, he was famous for sneaking artworks into very famous museums, hanging them on the wall, and then leaving. And then going back there and photographing people as they admired his work hanging on the wall, And the works often took 2 or 3 days to be noticed, even by the staff. So this he hung in the General's Room at the British National Portrait Gallery in London, amongst all those very famous generals of history. So very humorous and